Bias was born on November 18, 1963. He grew up in Landover, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C. Bias quickly developed a reputation of being someone who didn't fold under pressure. In fact, the pastor at his local church gave him the nickname Frosty because he had a cool, laid-back demeanor. Bias grew up in a close-knit family with his parents, James Bias Jr. and Dr. Lenise Bias. Bias was the oldest of 4 children, having 2 brothers, Eric and James III, and sister Michelle. The family was devoted to their Christian faith, and all signs pointed to Bias succeeding at everything that he chose to do in his life. Bias would first discover sports when he was in elementary school. He would attend his neighborhood's community center and was quickly introduced to football. Bias started playing on the community football team, and his natural athletic ability was apparent to all that watched him. It wasn't until Bias reached the 8th grade that he discovered the game of basketball, and by the 9th grade, Bias had turned into a star player. This got Bias's mother off guard, as she never expected her son to become a great basketball player. Quote, "I just thought it was an opportunity for him to be involved in some type of sports activity that would keep him occupied and just have something to look forward to, but it blossomed into something completely different. When we would attend the games from the 10th grade to the 12th grade, you could see the progression from this little lanky kid in middle school to an all-star athlete by the time he was in high school." End quote. This skill Bias had didn't occur naturally. Yes, his incredible athletic ability was 100% something he was born with, but actual basketball skills is something Bias had to develop himself. Wharton Lee Madkins was Bias's basketball coach at the Rec Center basketball team, as well as the director of the Rec Center itself, and he once spoke about Bias developing his basketball skills. Quote, "When he was young, kids used to laugh at him when he played basketball. They never picked him on a team. Then he ended up with everyone wanting him on their team." End quote. By the time Bias reached high school, he quickly became a star on his school's basketball team. He attended Northwestern High School, and in 1982, Bias led his team, the Wildcats, into the Maryland State AA Finals. Bias averaged 20 points, 12 rebounds per game while shooting 68% from the floor. His sensational play earned him the Washington Post First Team All-Met choice. Bias was also selected to the Capital All-Stars team for the 9th annual Capital Classic. In the Capital Classic, Bias scored 18 points while grabbing 11 rebounds. The Capital All-Stars won the big game 82-79 against the US All-Stars. Bias, along with teammate Johnny Dawkins, would be named co-MVPs for the game. So with high school out of the way, of course, college ball was calling Len Bias's name. A lot of colleges, top ones, were thinking that Len Bias would fit perfectly on their team, but Len Bias had other plans, choosing to stay close to home by playing for the University of Maryland. They welcomed him in 1982, and after being a star in high school, Bias figured he'd be a star in college, and he was right. Bias's first year at the University of Maryland didn't go quite the way he wanted it to. He only played 22 minutes per game and scored 7.1 per game. But by his second year at the University of Maryland, Bias started to show everyone why there was so much hype around him coming out of high school. Bias's scoring rose to 15.3 points per game, and he shot 56.7% from the field. It wasn't just the higher percentage he shot, it was the way he scored the basketball that was so impressive. Len Bias attacked the rim like no player of his size has ever done in college basketball, according to many. Bias, standing at 6'8" and weighing 210 pounds, attacked the hoop like he was Shawn Kemp. He also had a sweet jump shot that Kemp himself never had, making Bias a truly unique player, especially for his time. On top of his offense, Bias was also a versatile defender. Bias was also known as a player who sometimes lost his temper. He often jawed at opponents while on the court, and he once threw the ball at a referee in high school. Still, this aggression came from Bias's determination to win and be the best player he could be. Bias also enjoyed working out, keeping his body in tip-top shape, so no matter who his opponent was on the basketball court, Bias was confident in his ability to outwork whoever stood in his way. Most people only saw Bias the dominant basketball player, but to his friends and family, he was so much more, of course. Bias was a fun-loving guy who enjoyed riding around in his car and listening to his favorite CDs. Bias also was still a devoted Christian even by the time he reached college, and Bias didn't live the crazy lifestyle that you would assume most college kids lived, probably because of that faith. According to Bias's childhood friend Terrence Lewis, not only did Bias not participate in doing drugs, he didn't like to drink alcohol either. Quote, "Sometimes I'd say afterwards, let's go get a drink. He'd say, no, I'm not drinking right now." He was very strict about what he put into himself. He was proud of his physique. He'd joke about it, say, "I'm not taking anything to hurt this body, this physical specimen," end quote. On top of staying away from drugs, Bias was also staying away from women, as he knew some women in college looked at athletes as a way to get money. That was according to him anyway. This was something Bias didn't care much about. All he wanted to do was play basketball and continue to work on his game. Bias would continue to improve his game, especially in his junior and senior years. He averaged 18.9 points per game on 52.8% shooting as a junior and 23.2 points per game on 54.4% shooting as a senior. Bias's accolades include 2 ACC Player of the Year awards, 2 All-ACC First Team selections, and All-American honors in 1985 and 1986. In an interview with Duke Blue Devils head coach Coach K, he had this to say about the best players he's ever coached against. Quote, "In the 40 years I've coached at Duke, the 2 opponents that were the most talented were Michael Jordan and Len Bias. They had the it." End quote. In the early 1980s, Michael Jordan was known as the best college basketball player in the country, and Bias quickly made it known he was right up there with Jordan. Some people even called Bias a bigger Jordan because of their similar playing style, as Bias stood 2 inches taller. And this wasn't some crazy statement or anything. Bias had a similar skill set to Jordan at the time, and arguably he had some better skills than Jordan, at least the college version of him. He was quicker and he was taller than Jordan, and a lot of NBA teams worried about the future, their rival teams drafting this guy and him absolutely obliterating them. But for now, Bias was in college still, and he was battling the previously mentioned Jordan for the title of the best basketball player in the country at the college level. Bias and Jordan played against each other 4 times in their careers. Even though Jordan's Tar Heels won 3 out of the 4 matchups, Bias did play well in those games. The first matchup between Bias and Jordan took place on January 12, 1983. Jordan finished with 21 points, while Bias, who came off the bench, scored 11. North Carolina defeated Maryland 72-71. The second meeting between the two would be played on February 16, 1983. Once again, Jordan would start for North Carolina, while Bias came off the bench for Maryland. Jordan got off to an incredible start with 15 points in the first half. He looked unstoppable, and Maryland's coach, Lefty Driesell, had a serious question for his team at halftime. Is there anybody in this room that can guard Michael Jordan? Bias's teammate Herman Veal raised his hand, ready to take on the challenge. And he rose to the occasion. Veal's lockdown defense held Jordan scoreless for the first 14 minutes of the second half, but Veal wasn't the only one who clamped down on Jordan. Bias also took a few possessions guarding Jordan, and he played him well. Maryland actually defeated North Carolina 106-94, which broke Maryland's 6-game losing streak to North Carolina. It was also North Carolina's first loss in the ACC that entire year. Jordan ended up with 25 points, and while Bias did only score 6, his impact on the floor was felt, and his leadership helped to guide his team to victory. The third meeting and first of the 1983-84 season took place on January 12, 1984. North Carolina would take this game, winning 74-62 in a lower scoring affair. Jordan had another solid game with 21. Bias, even in defeat, showed the world he was developing into the next star player in NCAA basketball. Bias scored 24 points, including over 16 in the first half. He looked unstoppable at times, but Jordan would be ready for the next game. The final meeting between the two occurred on February 19, 1984. North Carolina actually easily defeated Maryland in this game, 78-63. Jordan scored 25 points while shooting 71% from the field. Bias scored a quiet 15 points in this game. Even with this more lackluster performance in their fourth matchup, Bias did show Jordan and the world that he was on the up and up. As mentioned earlier, Bias's skills would continue to develop in his last 2 years at Maryland, making him arguably the best college player in the country. Bias's stellar play certainly caught the attention of the NBA and its teams. The one person in particular who really took notice of Bias was Red Auerbach, the Boston Celtics president and general manager at the time. Auerbach had been keeping his eye on Bias since 1984, and he made his first move to get Bias in 1984 when he traded guard Gerald Henderson and cash to the Seattle Supersonics for their future pick in the '86 draft. The Celtics won their third title of the '80s in '86, and were lucky enough to have the Supersonics' second pick of the 1986 NBA draft. After the Cleveland Cavaliers selected Brad Daugherty with their first pick, the Celtics proudly selected Bias with the second pick. The future was looking bright, not only just for Len Bias, but for the Boston Celtics as a whole. They had an aging roster, and Len Bias was looked at as their future. An example of how good it was going for Bias was the day before he was drafted, Reebok had contacted him regarding a massive shoe deal. They had seen what Nike had done for Jordan and wanted the same for their brand, and they felt like Bias could do that. It was reported that the shoe deal was going to be for over $1.6 million, which was huge at the time. This included a 5-year endorsement deal. And of course, shortly after this, Bias would be drafted, and unfortunately, this is where our story turns tragic. At 6:30 in the morning of June 19, 1986, a call came into the 911 dispatch center from a man named Brian Tribble.
Washington Hall. It's a man who's Len Bias, and he just went to Boston, and he needs some assistance.
What are you talking about?
Huh?
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about someone needs, Len Bias needs help.
Well, it doesn't matter what his name is. What's the problem?
He's not breathing right.
What's the address?
1103 Washington Hall on Maryland University's campus.
Washington Hall?
Yes, sir.
What's your name?
My name is Brian.
Brian what?
Tribble.
Tribble?
Yes, sir.
What's your phone number, Brian?
Len Bias' room. I don't know the phone number.
What's the room number?
1103.
1103?
Yes, sir.
It's just Washington Hall. What's the address of Washington Hall?
I don't know. There's no address for it. It's Washington Hall. Come on, Hungry Herman's. And go straight up there. It's on the right-hand side, sir. Please come as soon as you can. It's no joke.
Okay, Washington Hall, apartment number 1103.
We're giving them mouth to mouth. You can hear it now. Guys, you have to get him back to life. There's no way he can die. Sir. Please come quick.
Okay, Washington Hall and apartment room number 1103, right? That's 1103.
1103. 1103.
All right, we'll have an ambulance out, all right?
Excuse me?
We'll have an ambulance out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Tribble, a longtime friend of Bias, met with him, and they decided they wanted to celebrate Bias's draft success. They drove back to Bias's old dorm where they met with a few of Bias's Maryland teammates. What they decided to do next would unfortunately cost Bias his life. Bias, his teammates, and Tribble all decided to snort lines of cocaine. It's believed that this night was the first time Bias ever tried cocaine. Bias reportedly sat upon a bed, bent over a mirror, and called himself a horse. This was a nickname his teammates had used for him because of his on-court grace and physical presence. After this proclamation, Bias snorted one last line of coke. Bias got up to use the bathroom, stumbled, and fell back down on the bed. He then lapsed into a seizure. After noticing Bias slipping into a seizure, one of his teammates, Terry Long, grabbed a pair of scissors and he placed the handle in Bias's mouth to prevent him from biting his tongue. Bias's other teammates, David Gregg, held Bias's legs as Tribble called 911. Tribble's slurred 911 call would go down as one of the oddest 911 calls in history. From Tribble's repeated mentions of Bias's names to the slur in his voice to the rude operator, it was certainly odd indeed.
What are you talking about? What are you talking about?
I'm talking about someone needs, Len Bias needs help.
Well, it doesn't matter what his name is. What's the problem?
The ambulance came and wheeled Bias's body out of the dorm room on a cart with a white sheet over the top. At 8:51 that morning, Leonard Kevin Bias was pronounced dead. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, which the cocaine use caused. The shining bright light Bias was, with all that potential, was snuffed out forever. When Boston Celtics great Larry Bird heard about the news, he promptly had this to say: "It was one of the cruelest things I've ever heard." On a basketball level, Bias's death changed the course of history. If Bias was added to the aging roster of the 80s Celtics, he could have revived Bird's career, allowing Larry Legend to play fewer minutes to rest his injured back while blossoming into a star. The Celtics would have had a chance at winning at least a few more titles if Bias had lived and performed to expectations. 4 days after Bias had died, more than 11,000 people attended the memorial service at the Cole Fieldhouse, the University Recreation and Student Center where Bias played for Maryland. On July 25, 1986, Brian Tribble was charged with possession of cocaine and possession of cocaine with intent to distribute. Bias's teammates Terry Long and David Gregg were also charged with possession of cocaine and obstruction of justice. Long and Gregg were both suspended from the team, and all three defendants entered not guilty pleas in August. On October 20th, 1986, prosecutors dropped all charges against Long and Gregg in exchange for their testimony against Tribble. Then, on October 30th, the grand jury added 3 more indictments against Tribble, 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct justice and 2 counts of obstruction of justice. On June 3, 1987, the grand jury acquitted Tribble of all charges. Outside of the courtroom, after being found not guilty, Tribble said, "I love Lenny Bias. I always have, always will." Tribble escaped punishment for his involvement in Bias's death, but he'd soon find himself in more hot water. In October 1990, Tribble agreed to a no-parole prison term of 10 years and 1 month, plus a 5-year term of supervised release afterwards. These were from unrelated drug charges that came from an undercover sting. The 1980s saw a large increase in drug use, and then President Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy Reagan continued and, to many people, arguably started the war on drugs. President Reagan used Len Bias's death as one of the main catalysts for passing his drug bill. This included a mandatory minimum prison term of 20 years and a maximum life sentence, along with a fine for up to $2 million. This was for anyone found in possession of cocaine. The drug bill was also known as the Len Bias Law because of his high-profile case. The University of Maryland went under investigation after Bias's death, and an investigation discovered that Bias was 21 credits short of the graduation requirement, despite having attended the university for a full 4 years. In Bias's final semester, he earned no academic credits, including failing 3 courses and withdrawing from 2 others. The controversy over Bias's death and the investigation prompted athletic director Dick Dole to resign on October 7, 1986. And for the Bias family, unfortunately, their tragedies weren't over with Len's death. On December 5, 1990, 20-year-old Jay Bias, Len's younger brother, was gunned down in a shopping mall parking lot not far from the University of Maryland campus. It was said Jay was flirting with a jewelry store clerk when the clerk's husband saw and confronted him. After being threatened, Jay laughed it off and left, believing the incident was over. Then, outside in the parking lot, the husband of the clerk and another man drove up and shot into the car Jay was in, hitting him twice in the back. The worst part of it is, the guy that shot him used to know Jay. They had both shared the same limo when they went to prom just years before. In a sad and twisted chance of fate, Jay would die in the same hospital that his brother Len died at 4 years earlier. After the tragic deaths of both of her sons, Dr. Lenise Bias became a motivational speaker and life coach, preaching a message of hope, courage, and endurance. She created the Bias Foundation, Incorporated, a life investment organization that has developed community-based programs supporting families, communities, and youth. Part of the mission of the Bias Foundation is to develop specific programs for women, men, teens, and parents, helping to strengthen the lives of people in underprivileged communities. Dr. Lenise Bias misses her sons every single day, but she understands that their deaths have led to positive changes in the lives of young people, thanks to her hard work and the drug laws that came after Len's death. Quote, "I believe God had to take the best to save the rest," Dr. Lenise Bias said. "I am a firm believer that he has done more in death than he could have ever done in life." End quote. Len Bias's story is, of course, tragic, but let's not forget his life and how incredible he was as a basketball player and as a human being. We should honor him, as the Boston Celtics did on June 24, 1986, when they presented Bias's mother with a number 30 jersey with Bias's name on it. The College Basketball Hall of Fame also honored Bias on November 21, 2021, when Bias was selected to the Hall of Fame. This honor was well overdue for an incredible talent that could have been the greatest basketball player of all time for all that we know. So we at Basketball Dive want to hear what you guys have to say about Len Bias. I think personally, just as the voiceover guy here, that it's one of the most tragic stories in NBA history. And do you guys think that he could have been the greatest of all time? Did he have even more potential than guys like Grant Hill had he not been hampered with injuries to be the greatest of all time? We want to hear what you have to say below. And in the meantime, check out our other videos as well, showing on your screen right now.